Some landings are planned, others are survived. And every so often, an airplane touches down not on a runway, but on a street where no one ever expected to see wings overhead. A quiet highway, a neighborhood road, a strip of pavement meant for cars, not aircraft. Yet in these rare moments, pilots make decisions that matter more than altitude or speed. They choose the only option left: bring the airplane down wherever they can, and protect every life on board. Tonight, we look at the real stories behind those landings. Calm judgment under pressure. Seconds that changed everything. And why some of the safest endings in aviation happened far from any airport. If you enjoy these deep, fact-based aviation documentaries, please subscribe, like, and share. Your support truly helps us keep creating them. On a warm July afternoon, passengers aboard Air Canada Flight 143 felt the gentle, steady rhythm of a routine trip from Montreal to Edmonton on a Boeing 767 that was still new to the fleet. It was a quiet flight, smooth at altitude, the kind where people close their eyes, read a magazine, or simply enjoy the view. No one knew that deep inside the aircraft's fuel system, a chain of small mistakes had already set the stage for one of the most extraordinary landings in aviation history. The problem began on the ground with a simple conversion error. Air Canada was transitioning from imperial units to metric. Fuel had been loaded by calculating pounds instead of kilograms, and because the airline's new procedures were still unfamiliar, the mistake slipped through multiple checkpoints without being caught. The 767 departed with barely half the fuel it actually needed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The airplane climbed, leveled, and continued westward. But then came the first hint. A low-pressure alert on one engine's fuel pump. The crew worked the checklist. Seconds later, the engine itself shut down. Losing one engine is serious, but manageable. Losing both is something else entirely. Then, just minutes after the first failure, the second engine flamed out. The aircraft fell into a silence that modern jetliners are never meant to produce. The roar disappeared. The vibration stopped. The cockpit filled with an eerie stillness, broken only by airflow and warning chimes. A Boeing 767 had become a glider. With no engine thrust, no hydraulic power except what could be scavenged from the ram air turbine, and no ability to climb or hold altitude, the crew needed an immediate place to land. There were no airports within a safe glide distance. What they did have was an old military airbase at a town called Gimli. Except Gimli was no longer an airbase. The runway had been decommissioned years earlier and converted into something very different. A drag racing strip. Families camped along the edges. Children rode bicycles on the apron. Spectators wandered across the pavement. Caravans, tents, and parked vehicles filled the area. It was no longer an airport. It was essentially a public road dressed up as a racetrack. The pilots did not know that. Through the cockpit windows, they saw only a strip of pavement that might be long enough to save nearly 70 lives. They aimed for it. With no engines and no go-around capability, the approach had to be perfect the first time. But without thrust, the descent angle steepened. The captain bled off altitude by performing a forward slip normally seen in small training aircraft, not wide-body jets. The 767 dropped toward the makeshift runway as stunned spectators looked up, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Then came the touchdown. Hard. The nose gear collapsed and folded backward, and the big jet skidded down the pavement, sparks trailing underneath. It slid past the start line of the drag strip, past parked cars, past people who ran for cover, finally grinding to a stop only meters before the crowded area where campers and families were gathered. Incredibly, everyone survived. No fire, no explosion, no fatalities. Just a jetliner sitting on a runway that had long since ceased to be a runway. What made the landing so remarkable was not just the airmanship, but the environment. This wasn't an airport. It wasn't controlled airspace. It wasn't even a restricted field. It was, in every practical sense, a street. A wide strip of public pavement borrowed for racing, surrounded by people who were never meant to experience a commercial airliner arrival. Air Canada Flight 143 would forever be remembered as the Gimli Glider. A rare moment when a fully loaded passenger jet became powerless at altitude and still returned to Earth without a single life lost. It remains one of the best examples of how calm decision-making, teamwork, and a bit of luck can turn a disaster into a landing that should never have been possible. Chicago Midway has always been a different kind of airport. It sits in the middle of a dense city grid, surrounded not by open fields, but by houses, shops, traffic lights, and residential streets. Its runways are short, boxed in on all sides, and during winter its tight margins become even tighter. On a freezing December evening in 2005, a Boeing 737 approached Midway through heavy snow and gusting wind, landing on a runway layered with packed ice. The crew studied the numbers carefully during descent. The landing distance was right at the limit. Auto brakes on maximum. Thrust reversers deployed immediately. A perfectly centered touchdown. On paper, it was possible. In practice, conditions were worse than forecast. Midway's short runway gave little room for error. The airplane touched down long, the braking effectiveness was almost non-existent, and the jet began sliding more than slowing. Inside the cockpit, the crew pushed every available system to stop the aircraft. But the Boeing continued forward, as though riding on glass. At the end of the pavement, a metal barrier meant to slow overrunning airplanes provided only a momentary jolt. The jet burst through the fence, broke through the airport perimeter, and crossed directly into Central Avenue, a busy neighborhood street running just beyond the airport boundary. A car stopped at the traffic light had no chance to react as the aircraft's nose plowed into it, bringing the jet to its final halt between street lamps and residential sidewalks. For the passengers, the surreal sight outside the cabin windows was not an airport, but a city intersection with police lights and winter traffic. The accident became a sobering reminder that urban airports carry unique risks. When runways end only a few meters from public streets, every decision about speed, braking, and landing distance becomes critical. Even a perfectly flown approach can turn into a disaster when winter, short runways, and the geography of a city converge at the wrong moment. Congonhas Airport sits in the beating heart of Sao Paulo, one of the most crowded cities on Earth. There is no open buffer, no safety field, no empty grass beyond the pavement. At the end of each runway lies a busy avenue, lines of cars, buses, storefronts, and office buildings packed shoulder to shoulder. It is an airport carved directly into the city itself, and on a rainy evening in July of 2007, that geography turned a single landing into one of the most tragic reminders of how thin the line is between aviation and urban life. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 and Airbus A320 approached Congonhas through heavy rainfall. The region had been soaked for days, and the main runway had not yet been grooved to shed water. Pilots operating into Congonhas that week reported the same dangerous pattern. Braking action fluctuated wildly, sometimes disappearing entirely. Everyone knew the runway was slick, and everyone knew the airport had almost no room for error. But airlines kept flying in, because operations continued, and crews were trained to make these difficult landings. As the Airbus descended through the clouds, the crew faced another complication. One of the thrust reversers was locked out of service allowed under regulations, but it required extra precision on a short, wet runway. The procedure was familiar. Land firmly. Immediately deploy the working reverser. Apply maximum brakes, and trust the calculations. The approach was stable, the touchdown point was on target, and the wheels met the runway with a heavy splash. What happened next unfolded in only seconds, but was the result of many intertwined factors. On a wet, ungrooved runway that had pooled with water, the tires struggled to grip. The airplane hydroplaned. The working reverser activated, but the other remained idle, creating asymmetric thrust. Almost instantly, the A320 drifted off the runway centerline, sliding rather than slowing. The crew attempted to regain control, but the braking effect was nearly non-existent. The jet was no longer stopping, it was accelerating sideways toward the end of the pavement. Congonhas offers no real margin beyond the threshold. There is no wide field, no engineered safety area. Instead, there is Washington Luis Avenue, one of the busiest traffic routes in the city, followed immediately by a row of commercial buildings. The jet shot off the end of the runway, crossed the airport boundary, cleared the road in a horrifying leap, and struck the TAM Express cargo and administrative building just across the street. Fuel, structure, and impact combined to create an intense fire that engulfed the facility seconds after the aircraft entered it. Residents nearby described the moment as surreal, an airliner passing where only cars should be, bridging the space between runway and city street in a way no one ever imagines. For investigators, the themes were stark. Short runways surrounded by dense city structures. A wet surface with no grooves to channel water. A single thrust reverser out of service. A landing that was technically within procedures, yet unfolded in an environment that magnified every weakness. The accident reignited global discussions about urban airports, especially those where the distance from runway end to public streets is measured in meters. Kongenhas became a symbol of what happens when aviation infrastructure fails to keep pace with city growth. At such airports, a mistake, or even a normal landing under abnormal conditions, does not remain contained. It spills into neighborhoods, into traffic, into daily life. In the shadow of that day, the lesson was painfully clear. At some airports, the boundary between runway and city is so thin that the safety margin extends far beyond aviation. It becomes a responsibility shared with every person commuting, working, or living just beyond the airport fence. Teterboro Airport sits in the dense industrial web of northern New Jersey, surrounded not by open fields, but by warehouses, fences, office lots, and the constant flow of traffic on Route 46. It is a business jet hub tucked inside a crowded corridor, and on a cold February morning in 2005, a Bombardier Challenger 600 turned that busy highway into an extension of the runway in the worst possible way. The jet belonged to Platinum Jet Management, a charter operator with a history that investigators later described as troubling. Training irregularities, questionable paperwork, and loose oversight were common themes. But the crew that morning believed their aircraft was ready. What they did not realize was that their pre-flight weight calculations were wrong. The jet was heavier than assumed, and with incorrect V-speed set on the flight deck, the takeoff roll began with false expectations of performance. The Challenger accelerated down runway 24 at Teterboro, engines at full power, but the numbers did not match reality. Acceleration lagged. Airspeed crept upward far more slowly than the pilots anticipated. By the time they realized the jet was not reaching the speed required for a safe liftoff, they were deep into the runway with almost no margin left. The aircraft should never have attempted takeoff, and now it was too late to stop normally. One of the hardest decisions in aviation is rejecting a takeoff when the runway ahead is nearly gone. The crew initiated the abort far too late. Thrust came to idle. Brakes engaged. But physics offered no forgiveness. The jet skidded forward on a surface slick with winter grit, gathering lateral momentum as brakes locked and wheels lost bite. Teterboro's runway ends were never designed for heavy overrun impacts, and the Challenger smashed through the airport perimeter fence within seconds. Beyond that fence was no safety area, no engineered arresting bed, no empty buffer. Instead, the aircraft burst directly onto Route 46, one of the region's busiest highways. Morning commuters were driving the same stretch of pavement they used every day when suddenly a business jet appeared in front of them, sliding sideways across the lanes. Cars veered, braked, and scattered. A delivery truck clipped the aircraft's wing. Another driver narrowly missed the careening fuselage by only a few feet. Still moving at high speed, the jet continued across the road and into a commercial lot, slamming into the side of a warehouse building. The impact tore open a portion of the structure, scattering debris across the pavement. Dust, insulation, and fragments of metal filled the air. Inside the aircraft, seats broke free, bulkheads crumpled, and the cockpit absorbed a tremendous amount of energy. Yet amid the devastation, multiple occupants survived, protected in part by the way the aircraft came to rest wedged against the building rather than rolling or tumbling. For investigators, the accident painted a stark picture of systemic problems. The weight and balance numbers used for takeoff had been falsified during prior flights by the operator. Performance data had been routinely manipulated. The crew that morning believed they were within limits, but the aircraft was overloaded and performance calculations were meaningless. When the abort decision finally came, there was simply no runway left to save them. Every meter beyond the pavement fence, highway, parked cars, warehouse walls became part of the impact sequence. For the people who witnessed it, what they saw was unforgettable. a sleek white business jet crossing a highway like a runaway truck, cutting through the gap between morning commuters and plunging into a building only a few steps beyond. For aviation safety experts, the lesson was equally stark. When an airport sits inside a dense urban corridor, the end of the runway is not a boundary. It is a threshold to real-life drivers, workers, families, and entire communities. Teterboro learned from that morning. Arresting beds were built. Procedures changed. Weight and balance, oversight tightened across the industry. But the image remains. A runway that didn't end in grass or gravel, but in asphalt lanes, street signs, and the unpredictable flow of human traffic. A reminder that when a jet overruns at an airport like this, it doesn't just leave the runway, it enters the world. It was late morning over Louisiana when TACA Flight 110, a Boeing 737 carrying passengers from Belize City to New Orleans, descended into a line of severe thunderstorms. The crew saw what many pilots dread. Towering clouds filled with heavy rain, hail, lightning, and violent downdrafts. They tried to pick a path through, adjusting speed, altitude, and engine settings to limit damage, but the storm closed around them. Inside that wall of rain and ice, both engines began taking in supercooled water and hail. First came compressor surges, each one shaking the aircraft. Then came the sound that no jet pilot ever forgets. Silence. One engine rolled back, then the other. The thrust levers became meaningless. The Boeing was no longer climbing or holding altitude. It was gliding. A heavy, fully loaded airliner with no power, dropping toward a landscape filled with highways, houses, canals, and electrical lines. The captain kept the nose slightly down to preserve airspeed. The first officer worked the checklists, attempting multiple restart procedures. Both men knew they were running out of height, time, and options. Ahead lay a patchwork of suburban neighborhoods cut by wide concrete roads, drainage channels, and strips of green levee. There was no runway within reach. The engines made weak coughing sounds as the crew forced every possible restart attempt, but the compressors never came back. Another few seconds, and the plane would be too low to do anything except crash uncontrolled. The captain scanned the terrain and found the only usable surface. A narrow, grassy levee near the intracoastal waterway. It was barely long enough. It was not level. It was lined with poles and brush. But it was all they had. The crew configured the airplane for a power-off landing, lowering flaps by battery power to widen the margin of control. Passengers sat in complete silence, watching raindrops streak sideways on the windows as the ground rose rapidly. The captain held the glide with remarkable precision. Too high, and they would overshoot into water or trees. Too low, and they would strike the levee's slope instead of the top. At the last moment, he eased the nose up, cushioning the touchdown as much as a powerless jet could. The Boeing settled onto the grass with a long, sliding shudder. Mud and turf sprayed around the fuselage as the wheels dug into the levee, but the jet stayed upright. It stayed on course, and it stayed in one piece. When the aircraft came to a stop, the passengers stared out the windows and saw something unexpected. They were not on an airport. They were not on a runway. They were parked neatly on a narrow levee, with a highway on one side and a canal on the other. Cars slowed down. People stared in disbelief. A commercial airliner had just landed among them without engines, without thrust, and without a single life lost. Emergency crews reached the aircraft by driving along the grass, and the evacuation began calmly. Many passengers stepped onto the levee and realized how close the wings had come to light poles and embankments. A few meters either way, and the outcome would have been very different. TACA Flight 110 became one of aviation's most impressive examples of off-runway survival. A powerless jet, descending through a violent storm over a city, guided onto a surface never designed for airplanes. It proved the value of discipline, training, and airmanship at the edge of disaster. Sometimes a runway is not where a landing ends. Sometimes, survival depends on seeing a narrow strip of earth in the middle of a city and choosing it with absolute precision. It was a cold December morning in Sweden when Scandinavian Airlines Flight 751, a McDonnell Douglas MD-81, prepared for departure from Stockholm. Snow had fallen through the night. The aircraft had spent hours parked on the ramp, slowly collecting sheets of nearly invisible clear ice on the wings. When the crew arrived, the temperatures fluctuated around freezing, the kind of weather that makes ice look like a thin sheen of wet metal. The aircraft was de-iced before pushback, but what no one realized was that the MD-81 had a design quirk. The leading-edge flaps, known as slats, were retracted during de-icing. Ice hidden behind them could not be sprayed away. When the crew advanced the throttles for takeoff, that trapped ice broke loose and slid back directly into both engines. At first, everything seemed normal. The jet accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the gray winter sky. Then came a heavy vibration, a deep shudder, a sound like hard hail striking metal. Inside both engines, blades began taking hits from chunks of clear ice that had been welded to the wing by the freezing night. Within seconds, the right engine surged violently and rolled back. The left engine followed. Power dropped almost symmetrically. The cockpit shook as the airplane lost thrust during its initial climb, only a few hundred feet above the ground. The captain pushed the nose down gently to hold airspeed. The first officer worked the restart procedures, but nothing came back. The MD-81 was now a heavy glider, sinking over the forests and farms north of Stockholm. Snow-covered fields stretched into the distance, separated by lines of trees and frozen ditches. There was no runway within reach, no safe turn back to the airport, no place that resembled a prepared surface. The only option was to keep control, keep the speed alive, and find an area flat enough to absorb the impact. With both engines gone, all the airplane had left was momentum, gravity, and the crew's judgment. The captain leveled the wings and aimed for a patch of open land near the village of Gotrura. Trees loomed ahead. The descent rate was high. The nose came up slightly as the captain bled off the last bit of speed to soften the touchdown. A heartbeat later, the MD-81 struck the treetops, sliced through them, lost pieces of its underside, and came down hard in a snow-covered field. The airplane hit, slid, bounced, and broke apart into 3 major sections. The tail separated behind the wings. The forward fuselage cracked open near the first rows of seats. Snow burst in all directions as the jet came to rest. Yet inside that broken fuselage, something extraordinary happened. The cabin remained largely intact. The structure absorbed the energy like a giant crumple zone, slowing the deceleration enough for passengers to survive. People stood up in stunned silence, shocked that they were still alive, staring at the ruptured walls and the winter air pouring inside. Emergency exits opened into deep snow. Passengers stepped out into a landscape that looked more like a quiet countryside than the aftermath of a major air disaster. There was no fire, no explosion, just a silent field, a shattered jet, and dozens of people who had escaped one of the most dramatic dual-engine failures in commercial aviation. Investigators later confirmed that the hidden ice had been the trigger. The design allowed it to accumulate where ground crews could not see it. The engines had swallowed it whole at the worst possible moment. But they also confirmed why every life on board had been saved. The pilots had kept the wing level, managed the glide, avoided a stall, and selected the only landing area that gave anyone a chance. They executed a powerless off-runway landing in winter conditions with almost no time to think, guiding a broken jet safely into the snow. Scandinavian Airlines, Flight 751, became one of the clearest examples of how a controlled landing, even without engines and even far from any runway, can save every soul on board. In the end, the airplane broke into 3 pieces, but everyone walked away. It was a rainy winter night on the Black Sea coast, the kind of night when the shoreline disappears into darkness and every light reflects off wet pavement. Pegasus Airlines Flight 862, a Boeing 737, arriving from Ankara, approached Trabzon Airport through low clouds and steady rain. The runway sits only a short distance from the sea, built on flat land carved between the city and the shoreline. On one side lies the airport boundary fence. On the other, a steep, muddy embankment leading directly down to the water. There is almost no margin for error. Every arrival demands precision. Every landing roll depends on traction. And on this night, the surface was slick, the weather unstable, and the runway waiting like a narrow strip balanced between land and sea. The crew touched down normally. Tire spray burst behind the wings. The airplane decelerated, tracking the centerline as reverse thrust engaged. But a few seconds later, something changed. The jet began to veer gently to the left. At first, it felt like a minor slide, the kind that happens on wet pavement. But the slide did not correct itself. It grew. The nose drifted further left. The rudder input had less effect than expected. The plane began pulling toward the edge of the runway. The captain tried to counter with rudder and differential braking, but the wheels were gliding across a thin layer of mud and rubber residue. The Boeing's left side dipped slightly as it left the paved surface. What had been a routine landing had turned into a critical situation in a matter of seconds. Passengers felt the sudden sideways motion and heard the change in engine pitch as the airplane drifted toward the edge of the world. Beyond the pavement was a steep embankment of wet soil and grass, softened by weeks of winter rain. The 737 slipped off the runway shoulder and began sliding down the slope, nose first. The cockpit windows tilted downward as the sea came into view, a dark expanse lit only by airport floodlights and the reflection of the moon. Mud splattered the fuselage. The aircraft pivoted as it slid, twisting sideways, almost rotating fully around. Inside the cabin, items flew from shelves. People grabbed seatbacks. A few passengers screamed as the airplane shifted again, tilting further, until it finally came to rest halfway down the embankment, leaning on its right side, the nose pointing sharply toward the water. When the slide stopped, the cabin fell completely silent. Some passengers later described hearing only the wind and the sound of mud settling against the fuselage. Through the windows, they saw nothing but darkness and the faint shimmer of waves below. The airplane had come to a halt just short of the sea, held in place by loose earth mixed with concrete debris. 1 more meter, and the jet would have fallen into the water. 1 more degree of tilt, and the fuselage might have rolled. But it stayed upright enough for evacuation. Flight attendants opened the forward doors carefully, uncertain of the ground below. The slides deployed and ended on the uneven slope. Passengers were guided out one by one, told to step slowly, not run. Some descended directly onto mud. Others climbed through tilted aisles to reach exits that were now several meters off the ground on the uphill side. Emergency crews scrambled down the slope in boots that slipped with each step. Blue lights reflected off the fuselage as firefighters stabilized the aircraft and helped passengers away from the edge. When daylight arrived, the full scene became clear. From above, the Boeing 737 looked impossibly out of place, lodged sideways on a cliff of reddish-brown earth. 1 wing hovered above the drop toward the sea. The engines were half buried in mud. The runway sat far above, perfectly dry now, as if nothing unusual had happened. Photographs spread around the world within hours. A commercial jet, resting diagonally between a runway and the sea, became one of the most dramatic off-runway images of recent years. Despite the violence of the slide and the precarious final resting position, everyone survived. Not a single passenger or crew member lost their life. Investigators later looked at runway conditions, braking effectiveness, reverse thrust behavior, and ground handling characteristics. But the outcome remained remarkable. An aircraft had left the paved surface at speed, slid down a muddy slope, spun almost completely around, and stopped just short of plunging into the Black Sea. And every soul on board walked away. Pegasus Airlines Flight 8622 became a powerful reminder of how fragile the boundary is between a runway and the world beyond it. Sometimes, the difference between a safe landing and a catastrophe is measured not in miles or even meters, but in the depth of a slope, the angle of an embankment, or the firmness of wet soil under heavy landing gear. On that night in Trabzon, 1 jet slid past the limits of the airport and into a space no aircraft should ever enter. Yet it ended with life preserved, not lost. An off-runway accident frozen in a moment on the edge of the sea. It was early evening in Istanbul, and rain had been falling for hours. The runway at Sabiha Gökçen Airport glistened under the approach lights, a slick mirror of water and rubber that made every touchdown more demanding than usual. Pegasus Airlines Flight 2193, a Boeing 737 arriving from Izmir, lined up with the runway through low clouds and shifting winds. Crew reports that day described gusty conditions, unstable air, and runway contamination varying from damp to fully wet. Sabiha Gökçen is a major city airport, bordered by roads, terminals, and dense infrastructure. There is little open space beyond the pavement. When an airplane lands long or brakes late, the margin for recovery shrinks dramatically. And on this night, that margin would disappear almost instantly. As the 737 descended through the rain, the crew worked to keep the approach stable. The airspeed fluctuated as gusts swept across the runway threshold. The airplane crossed the numbers fast and touched down further along the runway than ideal, a long landing that immediately reduced the available stopping distance. Reverse thrust deployed, but on a wet surface the wheels struggled to bite into the pavement. Passengers felt the wobble of hydroplaning as the airplane slid slightly before the anti-skid system regained control. The crew continued braking, but the runway centerline lights rushed past faster than they should have. The jet was still carrying far more speed than a safe stop required. The end of the runway approached, and the crew realized they were out of asphalt. Beyond the pavement lay a steep drop, a sloping embankment built to shield the airport from the surrounding roads and industrial areas. At the bottom were service paths, buildings, and perimeter fencing. When the Boeing ran out of runway, it crossed the last lights, left the pavement, and dropped onto the slope with a heavy jolt. The landing gear dug into the soft ground, sending the airplane into a downward slide. The forward fuselage twisted violently, the tail section flexed, and in a single brutal motion, the aircraft broke apart. The nose separated from the rest of the fuselage and came to rest far down the slope, tilted sharply. The center section split open, exposing the cabin interior to rain and debris. The tail settled further uphill, still partly intact. To outside observers, the scene looked catastrophic. A major commercial jet in 3 large sections, smoke drifting through broken metal, passengers stumbling out into mud and darkness. Inside, the moments after the break were chaotic. Overhead bins had burst open. Lights flickered. Rain poured in through ruptured panels. Passengers shouted for one another in the dim cabin, trying to orient themselves as the floor angle shifted beneath their feet. Flight attendants, themselves shaken, began guiding people toward exits that were now misaligned with the ground. Some slides dropped directly into mud. Others touched down on uneven concrete. Emergency vehicles struggled to reach the broken fuselage because the slope made access difficult. Sirens echoed against the terminal buildings. Airport staff and firefighters climbed the incline on foot, slipping as they made their way toward the scattered sections of the airplane. And yet, despite the violent impact and the dramatic breakup, a remarkable number of passengers survived. People crawled from cracks in the fuselage, walked down broken slides, and were helped away from the wreckage by firefighters and civilians who had run toward the scene. The survival rate was far higher than anyone would expect from an accident that tore a jetliner apart. Investigators later pointed to the effectiveness of the fuselage design, the quick actions of the crew, and the angle of the impact that dispersed energy along the slope instead of delivering it all at once. When daylight came, the world saw a surreal image. A Boeing 737 split into 3 pieces on a muddy hillside, only a short distance from roads, buildings, and the airport boundary. It was another reminder of the challenges faced by city airports like Sabiha Gökçen. There is simply no room to spare. When a landing goes long or braking performance is less than expected, the airplane does not roll into an empty field. It rolls directly into the edge of a city. Pegasus Airlines Flight 2193 underscored the fine line that separates a routine landing from a disaster in crowded urban environments. The jet overran the runway, fell down a slope, broke apart, and still delivered more survivors than anyone could have predicted. It remains one of the clearest examples of how unforgiving a short overrun can be, and how critical speed, distance, and weather awareness are in the final seconds of every approach. It was just past midnight in Halifax, deep in the heart of a Canadian winter, when Air Canada Flight 624 began its final descent toward runway 05. The storm had intensified through the evening, coating the airport in blowing snow and shrinking visibility until the world outside the cockpit became a white tunnel lit only by runway approach lights. The Airbus A320 sliced through that tunnel with steady autopilot guidance. But even the most advanced systems struggle when blowing snow hides the horizon, masks depth perception, and erases the visual cues pilots rely on to judge altitude in the final seconds. Crews had been diverting or holding all night, but Flight 624 was cleared for an approach, given that the reported visibility met minimums. What the reports could not convey, however, was how deceptive the view would become in the last moments, when the difference between runway and snow-covered ground nearly vanished. As the jet descended below cloud base, its landing lights illuminated a swirling white curtain. The captain and first officer strained to see the approach lights, the runway threshold, anything resembling pavement. Instead, they saw blotches of reflected snow sweeping across the windshield. The Airbus continued descending through the glide slope, but the crosswinds and drifting snow created subtle illusions of height and position. The aircraft passed over the approach lighting system, but the storm's intensity hid most of its structure. Snow-blown terrain appeared as a flat, runway-like surface. The transition from airborne to ground contact became dangerously ambiguous. In those conditions, even a few feet of misjudgment can produce a devastating result. At roughly 1,300 feet short of the runway threshold, the belly of the Airbus struck the localizer antenna array, a rigid metal structure rising from the snowy field. The impact tore into the lower fuselage, ripping open sections of the underside and severing wiring and equipment. The nose gear collapsed instantly. Sparks burst from beneath the aircraft as metal scraped across frozen ground. In the cabin, passengers felt a violent jolt. Unlike any normal landing, overhead bins popped open, ceiling panels buckled, and lights flickered as the jet plowed through the snowfield. The wings clipped approach light towers, scattering debris and showering the fuselage with fragments of metal and ice. Yet, remarkably, the aircraft remained mostly aligned, sliding forward on its belly with the momentum of a high-speed landing. The Airbus came to rest beyond the approach lights, short of the runway, half buried in snow. The fuselage showed deep scars. The forward cabin had taken the brunt of the force, and sections of the skin had torn open. The right engine hung damaged, its intake filled with snow. But there was no fire. The aircraft had lost power, and the interior smelled of cold air and ruptured insulation. For a moment, passengers sat stunned, unsure if the airplane had stopped or if another slide was coming. Then the flight attendants began shouting commands. Evacuation slides deployed into drifts of snow. People climbed out into knee-deep powder, some stumbling in the darkness, others helping each other across the uneven terrain. Emergency crews fought through the storm to reach the wreckage, navigating wind gusts that still blasted snow horizontally across their headlights. In the clarity of daylight, the scene revealed just how close the jet had come to a far worse outcome. The undercarriage had been shorn off. The localizer structure lay mangled and torn beneath the glide path. The wings bore heavy impact marks, and the fuselage carried long gashes torn by metal towers hidden in the storm. But the aircraft had slid in a mostly straight line, shedding energy gradually across the snowfield rather than breaking apart abruptly. That controlled slide, combined with the crew's rapid evacuation, allowed everyone on board to escape with their lives. Injuries were numerous, but the survival rate was astonishing given the forces involved. Air Canada Flight 624 became a stark example of how winter visibility can trick even the most experienced pilots. Snow-covered ground can look like a runway. Approach lights can blur into the storm. Depth cues disappear. And a threshold can vanish until it is too late. The accident showed how vital stabilized approaches are in severe weather, and how unforgiving the final seconds of flight can be when nature hides the very runway pilots are trying to reach. The airplane never made it to the pavement. It landed instead on a snow-covered field that looked, for a moment, like the right place to be. But thanks to disciplined flight control and the energy-absorbing properties of snow, every person on board walked away from a crash that could easily have ended in tragedy. There is something quietly humbling about all these stories. None of these flights ended where they were supposed to. Some landed on levees, some in fields, some in rivers, some on streets just beyond the airport fence. None of those surfaces were designed for a jet. None had the smooth asphalt, lighting, markings, or margin for error that pilots count on. Yet in case after case, discipline, training, and sheer presence of mind turned impossible situations into survivable outcomes. These accidents remind us that aviation safety is not defined only by perfect days with perfect approaches. It is defined just as much by what happens when everything is wrong, when engines quit, when weather blinds, when the runway is too short, or too slick, or simply disappears behind a wall of white. when the airplane and the world around it stop matching the plan. In those moments, survival depends on judgment, teamwork, and the ability to stay calm when every instinct is telling you to panic. Off-runway landings teach the same lesson every time. That control, even partial control, is everything. A stable glide, a steady hand, a commitment to fly the airplane all the way to the ground. Those choices can turn a levee into a runway, a lagoon into a landing strip, a frozen field into a lifeboat. They show why pilots train endlessly for engine failures, rejected takeoffs, wind shear, and partial instrumentation. Because the real world rarely gives warnings, and safe outcomes often depend on seconds and inches. As you finish this video, take a moment to appreciate what it truly means to travel by air. Behind every smooth landing is a system built on lessons learned the hard way. Every survivor story becomes a blueprint for preventing the next tragedy. And every off-runway landing that ends with passengers walking into the arms of first responders is proof that skill, preparation, and human resilience still matter. If you found this documentary meaningful, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing. It helps us continue telling these stories with the care and accuracy they deserve. Thank you for watching, and until next time, fly safe.